He sat on the granite steps of the hotel, a dented paper cup in one hand and a paper bag sandwich in the other, as if the world outside the ballroom could not possibly contain the evening he'd been assigned to witness. Up close, his coat was more costume than cloth, stitched from thrift shop charity and afternoon shadows. But there was a familiarity in his posture I couldn't place at first, the way he folded into himself when someone glanced away, the practiced stillness of someone used to being unseen. Inside, crystal chandeliers threw a warm conspiracy over my family. Laughter ricocheted off marble. My sister wore a dress with a skirt that could have its own postcode. Her fiancé smiled like he'd already purchased the applause. They hadn't planned a normal toast. They'd choreographed a transfer. This is how it starts, I thought, the way power leaks when people believe affection justifies possession. They'd reheated old lines, family legacy, we all sacrificed, and placed them in the mouths of bridesmaids and second cousins so everyone could nod. It was theater. It was meant to shame me into handing over the penthouse I had paid for, the home I'd fought for, the asset the family always assumed I'd one day give back to the bloodline. I am a vice president at a firm where fluorescent light and quarterly targets taught me to parse motive down to its syllables. I did the work. I signed the spreadsheets. I negotiated the clauses that kept my deal clean. 5 years ago, when the offer for the unit came with a compensation package unusually generous for someone as junior as I'd been, I had pushed, politely, persistently, to convert part of that remuneration into real estate instead of stock options. I wanted permanence. My father called it vanity. My mother called it showing off. The company lawyer, good, watchful, and not sentimental, helped me draft a protection in a dense employee contract that I would never read aloud at family dinners. It was a corral more than a fortress, an agreed-upon line in corporate sand that made a coerced gift a very bad business move for anyone trying to hold power without consequence. It was not invincible. It was, though, precise in a way an angry demand seldom is. They did not know that. That was the point. My phone lay face up on the table near the hors d'oeuvres. I caught the red dot before I saw the camera. Someone across the room had started live streaming. The light on the screen blinked like a pulse. At first I assumed it was the usual. A few guests broadcasting for vanity, a cousin posting champagne selfies. Then the comments began to thread. What's going on with the speech? Is she giving the apartment? And one of them, vindictive, casual, typed, "Watch her hand it over. Classic." I had rehearsed this possible scene in the cold hours, not out of paranoia but out of self-preservation. I'd perfected an inward stillness that could be mistaken for compliance. Not because I wanted to be agreeable, because armor is quieter than anger when people you love weaponize memory. My mother took the mic. Her voice was syrup-sweet, practiced to sound surprised at every emotional crescendo. She pulled the string of the story, how the family had once been small and hungry, and how gifts to keep the name whole were a tradition. Tradition in this family meaning, we decide where your resources should go. She leaned forward in that way older women adopt when they want people to see the gravity of them. The room leaned in. My sister, mid-toast, smiled with the kind of patience you give to a performance that will end in applause. A cousin lifted his phone higher and the red dot multiplied, like a network of small, watching suns. She built that place herself, my niece said later, when the solicitude in the room cooled into commentary. She meant, of course, she was not born into it. The remark landed like a small, polite accusation. I didn't yell. I don't shout in rooms where every phone is a juror. I had rehearsed my refusal, gentle, unassailable. No, I said, steady, when the microphone came to me with the pretense of inevitability. I won't be giving anything up tonight. There is a silence that announces itself as moral condemnation. It was the silence of people who had already decided I had misused my fortune by failing to be properly grateful. My mother's smile tightened. My sister's grip on the bouquet shifted like a coiled wire. Someone giggled once, a brittle sound that echoed under the chandeliers. The livestream red dot multiplied into trending notifications sewn into every corner of our world. My phone chirped the first notification, a direct message from an old client, then another from a colleague, wondering if everything was okay. The comments under the broadcast no longer read like idle gossip. They read like an indictment. "She doesn't deserve that place," one commentator wrote. "Show us the keys," someone else demanded. I thought of the beggar again, the man on the steps. He had looked at me earlier, perhaps not at me at all, perhaps at how people passed him. But I had watched him, in the way people watch small, queer facts that intersect with their larger lives. He had collected the same glances I sometimes felt, those faint calculations that decide someone's humanity based on what they could inherit, what they could extract, what they could claim. My sister came up behind me for what she called an embrace and what someone else might have called a reclaiming. She pressed her palm into my shoulder and said, into my ear, just loud enough for the live mic to lap it up, "You can do the right thing. This is about family legacy." Then she slapped me. Sound in a room like that changes its nature when violence appears. The crystal clink of a glass becomes something fragile, a witness. The slap wasn't cinematic. No slow-motion hair or dramatic lighting, but its ordinary brutality sharpened everything. It was as if the world around us had been scrubbed of color. People froze. Someone's phone fell into the fountain of comments like an offering. I remember the taste of salt I thought I would have to swallow. Instead, I felt something like ice press into my ribs. The impulse to retaliate is a bright, dangerous thing. But I had been trained, professionally and privately, to convert immediate heat into long, cool leverage. I also had to make a choice for the next 5, 10, 20 hours of my life. Revenge that would hand the narrative to my family, or strategy that would close the door on their entitlement. I stepped back and did what I'd practiced. I unclenched my hands, smoothed my dress, and turned my face to the crowd as if the inconvenience was theirs to bear. The live stream catchers multiplied their viewership with the kind of gossipy hunger that fuels modern justice and modern cruelty. A chorus of notifications peppered my phone. Texts, screenshots, mentions. Someone mercifully had already posted the video to a news aggregator. In minutes, the room's private transgression was public currency. I don't tell you this to dramatize my hardship. I tell you because humiliations are how people like my family test obedience. They assume that spectacle breaks you. They don't do numbers. They do the math of shame. What no one expected was there was someone else in the wings with different arithmetic. He had come into the city that morning for reasons that, if you're cynical, would read like PR. He had been at the shareholder dinner the week before, said hello to the CEO on a charity board call, and moved through company circles with the kind of quiet gravity wealth buys. He was, by every public measure, the richest man in the city. He owned towers, had a sculpture dedicated outside an arts center, and a name that opened doors with a polite click across the marble floors of boardrooms. But his day had begun on the hotel's granite steps, his shoes scuffed, his hat a soft ruin. They told an ordinary story to ordinary eyes. He had told his team he wanted to test something today. Whether people would act the same when nobody thought someone important was watching. You can roll your eyes at this. You can say there's vanity in experimenting with kindness. You can suspect spectacle. I don't ask you not to. I only ask you to imagine the man who watched my sister slap me and the math he ran afterward. Reputation, shareholder stability, the simple ethics of whether a family should feel entitled to appropriate an employee's private asset. If you want to boil his motive down to something clean, pick one. He wanted data. He wanted to watch how the guests treated the rough and the powerless. He wanted to see if my family would take advantage of a human moment for a public victory. Whatever the phrasing, it had teeth. He didn't come as a hero. He came as a witness. He'd worn a coat that could be mistaken for someone sleeping rough, listened to conversations that floated out of the doors, folded himself into the edges of the evening where people's masks slipped. He didn't plant hidden cameras. He used his eyes and other people's phones, public recordings, volunteered footage, the live streams that thrive in our time. Every piece of footage gathered that day was a public document. People broadcast themselves. He compiled what already existed. He didn't invent evidence. He assembled the archive. While my sister's hand stung and the room's appetite swelled for spectacle, my phone buzzed with one-word messages. From corporate counsel, clause intact. From a trusted colleague, see you in 30. From him, a single line that read like a drop in midnight air. I'm on the steps. I could have invited him to stand in a spotlight and save me then and there. That would have made for an excellent headline. Richest man intervenes at family wedding. It would have felt like rescue. but rescue performed on a spike of adrenaline is rescue that leaves you with the next day. I had spent years learning that a public vindication that relies on someone else's generosity is brittle. Durable protection is built into systems. So I did nothing obvious. I said nothing more into the microphone. I let the room's noise close around itself like a trap. Outside, the beggar, the man in the scuffed coat, lifted his head from his cupped hands at least twice. Once, he watched a valet arguing with an older cousin who wanted preferential parking. Another time, he smiled at a child who dropped her bracelet near his feet and then allowed the child to put it back on without comment. There is a type of observation that pretends to be small and turns out to be precise. He was cataloging things. Who kissed whose ring, which guest offered him a sandwich with condescension, and which slipped him a bill and an actual conversation. He was not pretending to be invisible because he wanted to be. He was pretending to be simple so that the true simplicity of human behavior would shine through. The livestream's comment feed became a self-powered predator. She should apologize, someone wrote. She should go. Editors and strangers who had never met me passed judgments as if they were writing the receipts of my life. The narrative spun away from the room and into feeds, and then loops of feeds. It is astonishing what 2 minutes of a hand on an arm will do in a world wired to monetize outrage. I do not want you to leave here thinking I'm flattered by consequence. Humiliation is a brutality even when it brings sympathy. It digs into your hairline and leaves a residue. But it also clarifies. It reveals who will stand with you when the cameras cut between soft faces and hard calculus. Security moved to separate us after the slap. Their faces were unreadable, trained to be calm. My sister's fiancé held onto his phone as though it were a talisman that kept him in the story he wanted. My mother, cheeks slack with a filter of regret, mouthed something to the room about emotions running high. And the world watched. The initial clip, the slap, the stunned quiet, the microcosmic cruelty, was chopped, captioned, memed, and reposted. The numbers climbed in the way numbers do now. Human curiosity met with algorithmic appetite. The first flash of virality was raw and angry. The second wave, analysis, would be more dangerous. People who comment for a living call this the point when facts start to mean something else. That would be the part where shareholder perception and client tastes began to stitch themselves into consequence. I left the microphone on the podium without ceremony. I walked through a small corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and perfumed breath. My phone vibrated with messages, some concerned, some opportunistic. I pressed the screen to my ear, listened to the low hum of the hotel's HVAC, and wondered how many people in that room understood that property isn't just keys and brass. It's narrative, equity, and a ledger that can be read by more than judges. I went to the lobby to get air. That's where the city felt honest enough to let me think, where the beggar sat, where the man with more money than many countries had watched the room bend toward the idea that family can take what it wants. He shifted when I approached, and for a moment I thought I would see the face of a stranger, someone I might have given a sandwich to and left with a small sensation of charity. He looked at me with the kind of recognition that doesn't call for heroics. He tipped his head toward the ballroom door as if to say, I saw. I didn't say his name. I didn't need to. I already had a list of things to do, a meeting with counsel, a call to a friend who owed me loyalty, the push to remain measured in the face of spectacle. It felt like standing on a chessboard and not wanting to be moved into a corner because someone else liked the theatrics. He smiled a small, unobtrusive smile. They wanted something they weren't entitled to, he said. His voice was a low urban register, not theatrical, not staged. Yes, I said. My mouth tasted of salt and resilience. The lobby felt colder than the ballroom, like truth takes the chill of honest air. You're not alone, he said. There is a difference between hearing a promise and seeing the mathematics of support. He could have walked away. He didn't. He had already, weeks before perhaps, spoken to certain members of the board. He'd called my boss that morning under a pretense of attending a charity event. He'd ask questions nobody thinks to ask because they don't want to seem suspicious. The question, what happens if the family demands a handover in public, is easily shrugged off when you have lived your life within the polite assumptions of inherited power. For him, it was a problem to be solved, because he had the instruments to solve it. If you want me to step in, he said, I'll step in carefully. I laughed. It was the kind of laugh I reserve for battles I've already circled. Carefully isn't my language, I told him. But thank you. He raised an eyebrow. Carefully is the point. There is theater and there is leverage. If you want the first, I'm sure we can arrange an op. If you want the second, you'll need patience. At that moment, a screen in the lobby, the hotel's concierge monitor, the little consumer television that plays local news, blinked to life. The same clip from the ballroom filled the screen. The caption below read, in stark white letters, "Wedding scene turns violent, family dispute goes viral." Below the headline, people at the bar in the lobby lowered their drinks to watch. I thought about my father's hands, the ones that lifted my sister as a child onto a pedestal, where she could never really be toppled because we were not the ones with the power to fall. I thought about the legal clause tucked away in employment paperwork. Not a magic key, but a deterrent. It had been negotiated in a way that, if enforced, would make the logistics of seizing an asset messy in the right places, shareholder meetings being one of them, client confidences another. It required a network, yes, and a steward who cared enough to act. He stood, the man in the thrift coat, and the fabric sagged a little with movement. He wasn't doing a grand reveal. He was a man choosing to be a steward of another person's dignity, quiet and precise. I wanted to ask him why he'd gone to such lengths to be anonymous early in the day. The question felt blush-inducing, like asking why someone risked embarrassment to protect a stranger. Because, he said when I finally asked, I wanted to see who people are when no one is watching, and because you did the work. People should not be able to take that from you. Not because I say so, but because the market will chew you up if the rules aren't respected. Market? I repeated, the word taste-testing like iron. Reputation is currency, he said. In this town, narratives change boardrooms faster than lawsuits do. If people think you can be coerced, your position is weaker. Clients look for certainty. Boards make decisions based on perception. I don't like being surprised by lack of integrity. He spoke about leverage like someone who'd built it. Quiet, cumulative, grown from acquisitions and seatings at long tables where people learn to speak in terms of risk appetite. He spoke in a language I knew well, but had never heard couched in gentleness. It was not philanthropy. It was not a press release. It was stewardship, an adult's understanding that unchecked entitlement corrodes more than families. It corrodes markets and trust. The lobby phone on the stand buzzed. A notification pushed through my phone. The video's views had tripled. The first lawyer I'd texted called back. The voice was brisk. Ready. We have a clause, she said. We can activate measures, but it will look like we're weaponizing governance against a private family dispute unless we have clear cause. If we proceed publicly, and the board will be watching the optics as much as the precedent. Do it, I said. Not because I wanted spectacle, but because the choice was between letting my family write a story in which violation yields fruit, or refusing to let them write it and forcing the narrative into a realm where consequence, real, institutional consequence, becomes the currency. I chose the latter. The man beside me, his shoes still scuffed from the morning, looked out toward the ballroom. I didn't come to make a scene, he said. I came to bear witness. If we need to do more than that, we'll do it by the book. By which I mean shareholders, counsel, a measured release. People will say it's a stunt, I said. They might, he replied, but facts don't care about opinion. There's footage. There are witnesses. There are protocols. He tapped his temple as if the mind itself were machinery for decision. We both knew the danger. If the family could frame me as unstable, emotionally compromised, then the corporate protections might be recast as a personal shield being used for vanity. If they could sway public sentiment, watch how quickly sympathy becomes weapon. They could erode the very leverage I hoped would protect me. My task was to keep the moral high ground while forcing consequence into the places that hurt where the pride lived. Board seats, client contracts, reputations. There is a small rite of passage when you decide to weaponize process instead of people. You have to accept that it will take longer than outrage, and you have to be patient enough to let it work. I am not a patient person by temperament, but I had learned a necessary discipline, the slow burn that ends in closure rather than spectacle. Are you sure you want to be involved? I asked him. It was a question with two meanings. Did he understand the optics, and did he understand that becoming a protector in a personal dispute ages the protector as well? He smiled once as if he'd already made peace with the costs. Yes, he said. Back in the ballroom, the live stream numbers continued to climb. The man who'd slapped me had not left. My mother hovered like a lighthouse, trying to keep her light from revealing rocks. My sister's smile had become something brittle and small, and in its cracks I could see panic. They were recalculating, the way people do when the social script begins to smell like litigation. The first part of any public reckoning is the admission of a problem. For my family, that would look like an apology or a dismissal of the incident as a misinterpretation. For the people watching, it would be a morality play. For me, it would be a step into the machinery of corporate consequence, which is where power, true, structural power sits. I had to move carefully into that apparatus without the sanctimony of dramatics. I stood in the lobby and watched the man adjust the hem of his thrifted coat. His hands were clean. For a second, I thought of all the ways people define charity as a voyeuristic exercise, helping someone to be seen as generous rather than helping someone because of their inherent worth. He had avoided that trap the moment he chose anonymity. He had chosen to be small in public so he could later be useful in private. My phone chimed again. A headline aggregation service had pulled a frame from the live video. Family drama at high society wedding. Guest slaps relative. Underneath, the commentary began to split in two camps. The self-appointed moralists on one side, the pundits parsing transactional ethics on the other. Somewhere in those threads, the seeds of concrete consequence would take root. Reputation is granular. It accumulates through clicks, board gossip, and whispered concerns at client dinners. I said to him quietly, "If we do this, I want it to be about protecting people, not shaming them. I'm not interested in revenge." He nodded. Neither am I. At that moment, the lobby doors opened and a gust of cool night swept in, bringing with it the city's indifferent noise. Sirens in the distance, a late taxi's horn like a punctuation mark. A guest from the ballroom passed, phone raised, somebody else filming, some new angle. My chest tightened. The world had already begun its version of justice. The question now was whether institutional tools could translate that chaos into sustained protection. We paced the edges of that decision like two people standing in a doorway between what happened and what must be done. Crowdsourced morality had punctured the private. Now we had to harden the public into a protocol that prevented recurrence. "Call your counsel," he said simply. "And remember, we do not trade dignity for spectacle." I swallowed, tasted the edges of adrenaline and determination. The hotel's concierge had already printed a list of people who'd taken video and made them available to security. They were public records because people had volunteered them. My counsel would analyze what to do next. A measured escalation to boardroom pressure, notifications to clients if necessary, and a public statement framed to protect my position without flattening a complicated family dynamic into a legal spectacle. I thought of the beggar again. He'd chosen anonymity in the morning and the certainty that anonymous observation gives a person who wants to know, rather than judge. He had given me the gift that one usually expects from family, a checking of their choices through the lens of the people they claim to protect. He had been unadorned when he watched the room lean toward theft dressed as tradition. "Will you be willing to testify?" My counsel's message blinked onto my phone. She was brisk, pragmatic. "We can assemble the public record. We can argue for governance measures if this becomes a pattern." I typed back, "Yes, we'll assemble the record. We proceed." The lobby clock ticked in a way that felt like a hold beat before a reveal. I knew the man in the coat had every option to walk away and let me fight alone. Instead, he'd chosen to be a witness and, apparently, an instrument of leverage. In the world where I earned my life, that mattered. It would mean the difference between a family thinking they could extract from me with impunity and a family learning there are institutional boundaries you do not cross without consequence. I exhaled, and the breath felt like a hinge swing. There is a strange intimacy in the moment before an intervention, where you realize the outcome will not entirely depend on your own righteous fury, but on a chain of processes and allies who understand how the market adjudicates behavior. I wanted the personal satisfaction of a quick vindication, yes. More than that, though, I wanted the long-term peace of an arrangement that made violence and humiliation costly, not because I had been vindictive, but because we had mechanisms that protected the basic principle. You cannot publicly coerce another person into handing over their earned things without consequence. The man shrugged off the last of his thrift coat theater, and for the first time that day, looked like someone who had been slightly inconvenienced rather than performing. He looked at the hotel entrance, then at the phone in my palm where the viewer count climbed like a thermometer. "When you're ready," he said, "we do the work. The company will follow the fact pattern. Boards care about predictability. Clients care about stability. If the narrative is that you are protected by governance, then it changes the incentives in the room that caused the slap." "Do you ever regret pretending to be someone you're not?" I asked, absurdly curious. He almost smiled. "We wear many masks," he said. "Sometimes we have to take one off to see how the world wears its face." We stood there, two people on the edge of an unfolding set of events that would not be tidy. The live stream in the ballroom kept feeding the world. Inside, somewhere, my sister had found her footing again and was speaking to someone who might be willing to spin this toward contrition. Father was nowhere in sight. The guests were whispering and deciding who they would be in the story they'd just watched. I thought of the locks I would change that night, and the new security I would discuss in the morning. I thought of the way forgiveness can be weaponized to keep people poor, emotionally and economically. I thought of the kind of chosen family I wanted, the people who would show up when the cameras dimmed and the math of leverage began. My phone buzzed with a short, practical message from him that was neither boast nor claim. "When they ask why I pretended to be a beggar," he wrote, "tell them it was because sometimes empathy begins with anonymity. Tell them it was because I wanted to know who would offer a coin and who would take a home." I put the phone down on the marble ledge and watched the reflection of chandeliers fracture into the polished stone. The night felt like a coin spinning in the air, a small and bright mathematics of consequence. I had chosen the path of process. I had accepted that public vindication would come later, and that now, in the lobby's cold truth, I had to prepare for a different kind of fight. Less theatrical, more plotting, and, in the end, harder to hate. Footsteps approached. They were careful, deliberate. A security manager with a tablet walked up, eyes flicking to the screen where the live feed still burned. He nodded at me with a professional kind of sympathy. Behind him, someone else whispered that a particular board member had just been pinged about the incident and was already calling counsel. The door to the ballroom opened for a breath, then closed again. The sounds of the party were muffled, as if the world had put a hand over its own mouth. I felt the gravity shift, not with the bang of revelation, but in the slow efficiency of institutions waking up to a problem. When the man in the coat rose, he left a few dollars in his paper cup. He did not announce his intent. He did not want the applause. He walked toward the valet where a car waited, unremarkable, unannounced. The coat, for what it was, drooped on him like a small temporary flag. He did not look like a king. He looked like someone who had practiced humility so he could better calibrate justice. I stayed for a second longer, feeling the chill of being someone who had been publicly humiliated and privately anchored. My phone chimed with the first small headline, "Aggregators follow up." Insider sources say wealth magnate present at wedding. The words blinked like teeth. The man in the coat had already become a rumor. I stepped back into the party to collect myself, to face the immediate social economy of apologies and performs. I would have to speak with counsel, with management, and perhaps with the board. I would have to manage what would inevitably become a hard lesson for everyone involved, that dignity, when taken in public, can be reclaimed by process and by allies who understand how to translate public outrage into structural accountability. But the rules of this town are strange. Sometimes the person with the least visible power teaches those with wealth and status the most surprising lessons about humanity. He had spent the day pretending to be powerless so he could learn who in the room treated a person with kindness versus who treated them as an opportunity. Tonight, that learning would matter. I walked back to the bar and sipped water. My cheeks stung, not just from the slap, but from the realization that family sometimes looks like entitlement dressed in nostalgia. The work ahead would be less about making them see and more about making them pay, metaphorically, reputationally, institutionally, for the harm they thought they could carry off as tradition. A new message blinked on my phone from an unknown number. Footage compiled, time-stamped, ready to be shared with counsel. Another message. Public statement draft attached. And under all that, waiting like a quiet instrument tuned for later deployment, was a line in a contract nobody had meant to read aloud that evening. A protective measure, precise and unromantic, that turned a private demand into a corporate problem. It wasn't theater. It was leverage. The party cheered somewhere behind the doors as the DJ, unsure of the night's moral topography, pushed a song that made people sway. The algorithms churned. The world watched. I straightened my shoulders. The moments of humiliation do not end in the place they begin. They travel outward, into feeds and into boardrooms, and sometimes they return, altered as consequences. I walked out into the night, the city air biting at my face, and looked back at the hotel doors where the man with the coat had disappeared. The math of what we were about to set in motion began to outline itself like a plan. It would be long. It would be procedural. It would be harder to monetize in headlines than a dramatic rescue. It would, I hoped, be durable. And somewhere in the tilt of the evening, under the glow of sodium lamps and the sting of cold, I realized the lesson he had applied was simple. Dignity does not need an audience to be defended. Sometimes the richest man in the city must pretend to be the poorest for a day to remember that people are more than the sum of what they own or what they are expected to hand over. We moved slow and precise into the next day, as if the world required time to line up its outrage into actionable consequence. I slept in 15-minute increments, waking to my phone like a wounded animal. Alerts, tags, people offering help, and, in the quieter notes, pragmatists who knew how to turn a trending clip into a ledger that could bite. Counsel wanted timestamps. Security wanted footage hashes. My assistant wanted to know whether to cancel my appearances for the week. Friends texted love notes that read like lifelines. By dawn, the clip had been recomposed into every conceivable moral frame. Some edits leaned toward pity, others toward scandal. A conservative commentator spun it into a sermon about ingratitude. A podcaster made a 2-hour special about family entitlement. Somewhere between the sensationalized takes and the thoughtful essays, a pattern started to emerge. People who work with money, clients, outside counsel, board members, began to treat the slap not as a domestic failure, but as a risk. They began to count the cost of unpredictability. I went into my office with counsel at my side. The law firm I used had been pragmatic for years. They did not promise a cliff-edge victory. They promised process, document, preserve, escalate, in ways that could not be dismissed as mere theatrics. We compiled every public recording, phones surrendered voluntarily by a dozen guests and several staff members, hotel security footage shot in the open, the live stream that had first given the world its red dot. All of it was raw and public. None of it required clandestine methods. That mattered. It made the evidence a mosaic anyone could cross-check rather than a staged tableau. I don't trade my privacy for headlines, and I did not want a dramatic rescue at the cost of narrative dependency. I wanted durable safety. So we prepared a measured set of steps that would be visible, accountable, and crucially, anchored to governance, not to vendetta. The company had clauses in its handbook and stock documents that functioned as guardrails. The language was technical, not romantic. Those provisions made certain forms of coerced asset transfers and reputational conduct relevant to governance review. To some eyes, it reads like corporate nerd speak. To others, especially those who sit across desks at table meetings, it reads like a deterrent. At 11:30, the man who'd spent the morning pretending to be less than he was, Ethan Mercer, if you prefer a name you recognize, called to set a meeting at a neutral conference room. He arrived as Ethan Mercer, not as a man trying on poverty for an afternoon. His shoes were clean, his coat was an expensive cut that sat on him like restraint. There was none of the theatricality of a reveal. He was composed, almost bored by the drama, which made his focus feel necessary rather than performative. "You did not want a spectacle," he said without preamble. "You wanted the machinery of consequence." "Yes," I answered. The word felt small compared to the day's work, but it was honest. He placed a tablet on the table and without theatrics showed me an organized folder. Timestamps, public clips, witness lists, the names of guests who had recorded and voluntarily handed the footage over to hotel security, plus a short memo his in-house counsel had prepared explaining how shareholders and governance could be applied. Nothing on that drive was secret. All of it had been gathered from public streams or recorded and voluntarily surrendered. The framing was legal and practical, not vindictive. You went through the trouble of this, of disguising yourself. Why? I asked. Because the question had become private to both of us, and because answers like "to test people" can sound small when you try them on in daylight. Because sometimes the only way to see is to be anonymous, he said. When people assume privilege doesn't watch, they act differently. We have a moral economy here as well as a financial one. If people can publicly coerce others without consequence, it becomes a norm that hurts the market and the city. I care about that. I care about that a lot. When he said "we," he meant the civic "we," the systems and institutions that hold trust together, and a personal "we," people who believe that rules matter when money is at stake. He did not try to make his intervention sound noble. He made it sound necessary. We agreed on the approach. We would not blow open the family drama as if it were theater. We would file a complaint, fact-based, tightly argued, pointing to the public footage and requesting that the company's governance committee review the incident for its consequences on reputation and client confidence. He would, as a significant shareholder, request the meeting and make clear his expectation that the company act to protect employees from public coercion. He would use his influence not to attack the family but to insist that a private grievance being weaponized in public presented a real business risk. That framing prevented the response from being dismissed as personal favoritism. The first public consequence came within hours. 2 major clients requested a meeting to discuss risk exposure and the company's leadership. The conversations were not about morality. They were about continuity. If a key executive's personal life could be weaponized into a reputational problem, clients wanted assurances. That is the way markets translate human misdeeds into tangible harm, through loss of trust and the potential for disruption. My sister's phone began to buzz with messages that were not wedding congratulations. Vendors started to pull back. The florist called to cancel next-day deliveries from certain accounts. Brands that had agreed to sponsor wedding events now asked for clarity about their association. I did not relish this. I told my counsel so. Justice that hurts livelihoods is not what I asked for. I was asking for accountability, not slaughter. The family's PR person called and offered the scripted path most of these situations follow: rapid contrition, vague promises to seek counseling, a request for private forgiveness. That path is seductive because it offers a tidy arc: incident, apology, closure. It is also often insufficient. Because the slap had been public, the test was whether private contrition would be accepted as a cure for public harm. Ethan and the Governance Council were clear. An apology alone would not erase client concerns or the board's need to address risk. Later that afternoon, a short, carefully worded internal memo went to the board requesting a special governance review. Mercer joined the request as a named shareholder initiating inquiry. It read like corporate shorthand, temperate, fact-based, pointing to public evidence and signaling that investors were watching. Within 24 hours, the company's corporate secretary convened a special meeting. That was the point where private violence became a corporate problem, in a way the family could not spin easily away. Board meetings, board minutes, client calls, these are the slow gears that turn reputations into balance sheets. They are tedious. They are precise. They are, for people who want the long-term peace that comes from rules, devastatingly effective. What happened next was not theatrical. There was no grand showdown in front of flashbulbs. There was a controlled escalation. Council submitted the compiled footage and a chronology. The governance committee opened an inquiry into whether the public coercion of an employee constituted a reputational risk sufficient to trigger internal measures. The company's external counsel advised on narrative control, how to protect the company's operations while allowing justice to run its course. Ethan Mercer made a brief statement to the committee. He had been present at the hotel that night and had witnessed the incident in part. He had compiled publicly available footage and offered it to the committee so they could judge for themselves. Some in the family tried to paint him as a meddler, a man using his bankroll to interfere with personal affairs. That line was cliché because it had a kernel of truth. Wealth affords influence. But influence is not always indulgence. Mercer framed his actions as stewardship. Investors are custodians of the market's trust. When that trust is eroded by public displays of coercion, they have a legitimate stake. Public reaction deepened. A well-known nonprofit that had been aligned with my family for years issued a cautious statement that it was reviewing its partnerships. Several local businesses that had been known guests at our family events posted subtle distance-taking, donations under review, events postponed. The optics mattered. In a city built on networks and reciprocal favors, walking away is a communicative act. It says someone is less safe to be associated with. I spent much of that next week sitting in meetings where I had to displace personal feeling with technical detail. Counsel coached me on language. We are seeking a governance review, rather than my sister attacked me. The difference in wording was tactical and necessary. The board responded to facts. Fact patterns are harder to dismiss than screams. We built the fact pattern patiently: timestamps, voluntary uploads, witness statements. The narrative began to be built by procedure, not by rage. There were moments when the rawness rose up, and I had to hold it down. The memory of the slap flared sometimes when I caught my reflection in a glass partition. Once, late at night, a reporter called asking for a statement. The temptation to give an interview that would have felt cleansing was fierce. Instead, I told counsel I would let the process speak. That restraint was exhausting and paradoxically clarifying. It felt like refusing to light a match in a room full of gasoline. Consequences met accountability in forms both small and structural. The immediate consequence was reputational, a slow erosion of trust that affected my family's social currency, and in some quarters, its philanthropic clout. Sponsors backed out of future events. Invitations evaporated from inboxes that had once been full. More structurally, a small but important client, one that had been a frequent presence at family-sponsored functions, requested reassurances about leadership. They wanted to know the company would not be exposed to liability by association. Boards hate uncertainty. Clients hate surprise. The governance committee's review culminated in a non-public session where the committee recommended a set of actions: a measured statement acknowledging the incident, a recommendation for the board to adopt stronger policies around employee protection in public spaces, and, critically, a recommendation to engage in mediated dialogue where appropriate. These were not punitive measures in the vengeance sense. They were preventive measures meant to change behavior through structure. Mercer pushed for a public signal that governance could be a shield for employees against private coercion. He did not ask for anyone's head as a conquest. He asked for standards. The family, forced into the uncomfortable position of being the subject of a corporate inquiry, tried the usual stratagems: charm, contrition, the pleading for mercy that families sometimes deploy when their social assets are on the line. For a moment, the dinner parties that had always smoothed ruffled feathers were no longer the currency they used to be. Influence had a floor, public consequence had teeth. It was a painful thing to watch. The people who had always assumed their proximity to power made them untouchable, suddenly learning the reality that systems, if activated, can treat entitlement as a risk. At home, I changed locks that night. It was a small, literal act that felt like a declaration. I also changed password access, updated trustee contacts, and placed limits on who could access my building. Measures that are mundane, locks, access lists, updated legal designations, are often the scaffolding on which dignity is rebuilt. I took the precaution of informing the building manager that certain family members were to be denied access. It was a bitter form of boundary setting, but necessary. My chosen family, the friends who had stood with me privately, helped me move boxes and reframe my life so the penthouse would feel like mine again, and not a contested object meant to settle scores. The sister who'd slapped me reached out with a string of messages that alternated between apology and justification. She asked for forgiveness in a way that sought absolution rather than accountability. I answered once, a short note that acknowledged her apology but stated, plainly, that access was now restricted and that any attempt to breach those terms would be handled legally. Saying it felt like drawing a consequence line in the sand. It was not vengeful, it was protective. The more systemic fallout unfolded in press cycles and in the quiet corridors of client conferences. A couple of clients publicly distanced themselves with statements that emphasized safety and standards. Vendors revised their policies on public associations. The girl's fiancé, someone who had smiled like he was buying applause, found that several of his invitations melted away. People he had expected to rely on began to call instead about what they'd seen, and whether they could trust the relationships he'd been representing. The social web reknit itself around new rules. There was also pushback. Some commentators accused me of weaponizing governance and called the whole affair an example of how money distorts justice. That critique stung and, in the way of good questions, pushed me to examine my motives. I did not want to enter a world in which leverage becomes the default currency of safety for the privileged. But the reality is that sometimes systems respond to evidence, and when evidence is public and assembled properly, those systems can be used to protect the vulnerable. I allowed that paradox to sit in me without trying to smooth it into a comfortable truth. A week later, we convened a mediated session arranged by the company's counsel and overseen by an independent mediator. Attendance was voluntary but recommended. My sister showed. My mother came and hovered in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or to remain the patient matriarch. The mediator began by calling the meeting to order and setting ground rules. We did not read prepared statements into a camera. We attempted to speak into a space where truth could be heard by people who were not invested in the old scripts. My sister apologized again, this time with fewer qualifiers. "I was wrong," she said. "I let other people's expectations get into my voice." Her apology was not a restoration of what had been taken, but it was something. My mother wept quietly and said little. There were other family members who refused to attend. People make choices about where they want to stand in a reshuffling of moral economy. In the weeks after the governance review, several practical things changed. The company issued a public statement acknowledging the incident and affirming support for employees in public forums. They announced an internal review of policies around public coercion and clarified that any attempts to force transfers of personal assets in public settings could prompt governance review. The language was moderate and careful, but for those who understood the corporate scaffolding, it was significant. It translated the incident from private shame into a public institutional boundary. The move made it harder for the family, or anyone, to treat private coercion as an informal entitlement. On a personal level, the consequences were measured but meaningful. The family lost certain social privileges, and several philanthropic boards that had been automatic were now vetting relationships with more scrutiny. Sponsors withdrew invitations. The couple's wedding guest list thinned as brands and friends considered their own reputational exposure. That hurt them socially. I do not take pleasure in that. What I do accept is that public actions have public consequences, and that is exactly how accountability works when it is not a vendetta, but a structural response to a public harm. In the aftermath, I also found unexpected ballast. At work, my boss, someone pragmatic and sometimes blunt, called me into his office. He acknowledged the toll but said that the way I had handled the situation, refusal without theatrics, reliance on process rather than spectacle, had demonstrated the kind of leadership that mattered in turbulent times. He offered me an expanded role on a task force addressing reputational risk, the kind of committee that sounds boring in job descriptions, but matters where the rubber meets the road. I accepted it, not because I wanted a consolation prize, but because I wanted to be part of changing the systems that had let the spectacle gain traction in the first place. People who had watched the clips with outrage sent messages of solidarity. Neighbors I barely knew knocked on my door with casseroles and candles. Friends hosted small dinners where we laughed and mostly didn't talk about the slap. Those intimacies, human warmth in the form of food and little rituals, were as healing as any legal victory could be. Ethan Mercer, the man who'd chosen anonymity that day to see who people would be, never sought a parade. He asked only one thing: that the response be proportionate and anchored to prevention. We met once more on a rooftop overlooking the river, the city skyline smudged in twilight. He did not want credit. I wanted to know whether, when unobserved, people would behave differently, he said. What I learned is that for some, entitlement is performative. For others, it is a reflex. Both are harmful. I told him what the mediation had felt like: bitter and limited, but not meaningless. You made it possible, I said, and the words had the strange taste of both gratitude and caution. There is a power in being protected that can feel like dependency if you let it. We both understood the limits of his intervention. Influence can open doors, but it cannot exercise patterns. People change because they choose to change, or because consequences are unavoidable. Sometimes both. He shrugged. Perhaps, but someone has to be willing to activate the system. Otherwise, patterns calcify. I prefer to spend my time trying to uncalcify. We talked not about headlines, but about substance, about how companies can craft policies that protect employees from public coercion, about how boards should consider personal misconduct when it endangers client relationships, about how philanthropy can sometimes be a veil for power. Our conversation was unusually adult, less about saving anyone and more about constructing better guardrails. The months that followed were not cinematic. The viral burst decelerated. The family learned new lessons in slow motion, friendships frayed, invitations disappeared, and the comfortable presumption of entitlement lost some of its sheen. My sister took time to step away from the social life that had been a scaffold for her identity. She enrolled in therapy and, in small gestures, started to reach out to people she'd hurt beyond me. Not everything mended. Some relationships closed, others trespassed forward cautiously. That is the real arithmetic of consequence. It is rarely a cliff of instant ruin, more often a slow erosion that forces people to rebuild. I did something practical with some of the energy the situation released. I set up a small fund in my building for tenants who faced exploitation or intimidation related to social pressure. It was modest, seeded with a donation that made a small, tangible difference for someone who needed help changing locks or covering short-term legal fees. It was, in part, a symbolic act. Dignity can be protected with a lock and a key, and sometimes a little money, but more importantly, it can be protected when institutions, not just individuals, carry responsibility. The way I tell this story now is not a victory lap. It is a catalog of choices. Choose process over fury, assemble facts rather than whispers, allow institutions to be instruments of accountability when they are available. Hope is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a council meeting on a rain-slick afternoon. As for my sister, we have fragile, guarded contact. She apologizes more genuinely now, and she has done work to learn why entitlement looked like righteousness and how performance can mask insecurity. We are not back to what we were. That is okay. Boundaries have a way of reshaping relationships, and sometimes that reshaping is what keeps both parties from repeating harm. People asked me if I felt diminished by the publicness of the attack. I do not feel diminished. I feel clarified. Shame is not the same as moral failure. Humiliation is not a moral marker. It is a weapon used by people who confuse affection with ownership. My property, my penthouse, remains mine. My peace is guarded by locks and counsel and an institutional reluctance to be upended by spectacle. And Ethan, who pretended to be a beggar, stayed out of the limelight. Occasionally, he would appear in a meeting or a call as a steady voice arguing for practical policy. He did not want accolades. He wanted the system to hold. In the end, that was the most radical thing he did. He applied leverage not for revenge, but to stabilize the ecosystem so that other people would be less likely to experience the same public humiliation. People still tag me sometimes in old clips. Internet memory is long. I do not delete those tags. I can withstand being watched. The question is whether others can withstand being held accountable. I sleep better knowing that there is now a clearer line for what is unacceptable to the people who hold power in public markets. If there is a single small lesson I would hand to you, because this is not a manual and I do not pretend to have all the answers, it's this. Boundaries are not bitterness. Boundaries are a form of stewardship. You do not owe your peace to people who would take it without cost. If you are in a place of influence, use your leverage for systems that protect, not for spectacle that only rescues temporarily. When people ask me why the richest man in the city pretended to be a beggar for one day, I give them a simple answer. He wanted to see who people were when they thought no one important was watching. He wanted to know whether entitlement would reveal itself as habit or whether kindness would be chosen without an audience. What he found, what I found in that night, was not a dramatic moral tale where good triumphs cleanly over villainy. It was a messy human truth. Some people will take, some people will give. And systems, when properly applied, can change the incentives that teach people which one to be. I still own my place. I still walk through my front door and feel the small, private joy of a space that I earned and defended. I have guests who are chosen for warmth, not for proximity to my name. I host dinners where the conversation is honest and where people do not assume the right to my things. When the winter comes, I see my building's tenants walking past my window, and I think about the tiny fund I started and the lock I helped pay for. Those are small, stubborn acts of dignity. There will always be people who prefer injustice because it lines up with their view of the world. There will always be spectacles and viral judgments and pundits who scream for drama. But there are also people who will wear a poor man's coat to see who offers a coin and who takes a house. There are people who understand that the mechanics of reputation matter, that governance can be a guardrail. And there are, finally, the quieter people who choose to stand with someone without making it a headline. If you've ever had to draw a line with family, or to watch someone try to convert love into ownership, remember this. You are allowed to protect what is yours. Protection does not require cruelty. It requires clarity, process, and sometimes allies who know how to translate outrage into structural answerability. I don't tell you this to make you feel small, nor to sell a strategy as a panacea. I tell you because dignity deserves the patience of systems and the courage of people willing to step in when spectacle would otherwise win. If you find yourself in a room where people assume they can take from you, don't let the world make you choose between being lonely and being violated. Choose structure. Choose the slow work that reshapes incentives. Choose the people who will stand with you long after the cameras have moved on. And if you found this story useful, or if you've ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you love, share it with them or leave a comment. I'd like to hear which side of the line you stand on.